Hi everyone and welcome. Today I will recommend some short fantasy books to you. I think that these will be perfect if you're in the middle of a reading slump and you want to start and finish a book rather quickly, or if you are in the middle of multiple dense and big fantasy series and you just want to have a quick snack. Now, I have defined a short fantasy book as anything that is below 300 pages, but I do know from the results on my community tab poll that the majority of you actually think that a book under 350 pages is still short. So I have done the following. I will recommend these books from shortest book to longest book, and the majority of them will be below 300 pages. However, towards the end, I will have some honorable mentions that are between 300 and 350 pages and that I still want to include for one way or another. Now, I do have quite a bit of books to get through, so without further ado, let's get into the books. And the first book that I want to recommend, and the shortest one on the list, is The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Niveau. This is the first one in a series of novellas, and the third one is coming out later this year. I think if you like a story within a story, you will absolutely adore this book, because we only have two main characters in present time. We have a clerk and an old woman, and the old woman is telling the clerk the story of the Empress. Now, this feels like a fairy tale. Part of it is Niveau's writing style, and the other part is that she chooses to have some repetition of certain sentences. We know that a revelation is coming in the story of this old woman, and Niveau masterfully conducts this to the reader by letting the old woman at the end of each chapter, when she has told a small part of her story, ask the clerk, do you understand yet? And I think that this really adds to the atmosphere. Now, even though this is the first one in a series, this has a very contained story and it reads as a standalone. And I think at the end you will have a very satisfying ending and you will have a very clear message, which of course also adds to the fairy tale-esque atmosphere. I highly recommend this one and I cannot wait to pick up the second book in the series. Now, next up, I have another novella. I wasn't blown away by this, I really enjoyed it, but I do know that a lot of other people absolutely adore this one. And that is Rainshot by P. Jelly Clark. This one only has 180 pages, so again, still a very short and quick read. I think that the premise here is extremely interesting because this story takes place in the beginning of the 20th century. In this world, we also have the Ku Klux Klan, but unlike in our own world, where the Ku Klux Klan consists of some vile human beings, here some of them are actual demons. Most people cannot see them, they see them as normal human beings, but we do have a small group of people in the world who actually see them for what they are. And we are following a small group of these people who are actually demon hunters. Now, this sounds absolutely amazing, and I do think that the characterization here was done beautifully, but a lot is happening here. This is a very fast-paced story, and I think that all of the things that we come across in this book, including a dream world, some very intense magical scenes that I didn't really understand because it was just so fast-paced. So I would have liked it to be more fleshed out. But if you don't mind that, and if you do like a fast-paced story, and if you're looking for a novella that has some more into it, that has more intricate world building and magic system, then I do think that you will enjoy this one. And just for the premise alone, I would highly recommend giving this one a try. Next up, I have two fairy tale retellings, one that I absolutely adored, that was an all-time favorite, and then one where I had some issues, but these are very specific issues, and if you don't have them, I do think that this one is worth picking up. And that is In the Vanisher's Palace by Aliette Bodard, which is just under 200 pages. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but the way that it is done is very unique in my opinion. This world has been visited by another species, and we don't really know what happened exactly, but because of this visit, we now have disease in this world, and we have multiple mutations. And this is actually part of the world building and part of the magic and fantastical elements. And I thought that that was a very unique take on a very traditional fairy tale retelling. Now, the beast here is actually a dragon, it's a shapeshifter, and she is seen as a very powerful being, almost as a goddess. And in the beginning of the book, our main character comes in depth with this powerful being, and because of this she needs to go to their palace and actually tutor their children. Now, I also liked this, which was an extra addition to the story. We now have these two children as well. But of course there is a romance. And because this dragon is more the Asian presentation of dragons, so more serpent-like beings, and even though this is a shapeshifter, because of this, the romance felt very icky to me. There was also a little bit of smut. It's not extremely detailed, but that just threw me off the story. I think if you don't mind it that much, that this story, which is also very fast-paced and was also one of my issues, I think that you will still like it if that doesn't really bother you that much. And like I said, the world building is extremely unique, and I do like what Aliette Bodard did with this very traditional fairy tale. But then we have a fairy tale retelling that I absolutely adored, and that is The Raven and the Reindeer by T. Kingfisher. This is a dark fairy tale retelling of the Snow Queen, and in this book we have a female main character. Now, one night, her sweetheart, or at least the boy that she's in love with, gets abducted by the Snow Queen. And we all know if that happens, he's gone. He's not coming back. However, this girl does not believe that, and she goes on a journey trying to retrieve this boy. On this journey, she meets multiple people, some of them very strange, and also a raven and a reindeer, who become her companions, and of course, that's why we have this title. This also has a sapphic romance, which I think was very well executed. It has dark moments, but it also has some funny moments. Now, if you're not the fantasy romance crowd, I think you will still really enjoy this, because the romance is definitely not the center of the story. And as all fairy tale retellings, it has a very enjoyable message as well. So this one I highly recommend. I do know that T. Kingfisher has written a lot of books. A lot of them are fairy tale retellings. Some are original fairy tales. Some are not even in the fantasy genre. So she's definitely a jack of all trades. And I do want to read more by her. And I think that the majority of her books are actually quite short. Now, after all of this talk of fairy tale retellings, I also wanted to recommend an original fairy tale. And I went with The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia A. McKillop. Patricia A. McKillop is another one of those authors with a very big backlog. She has written a lot of books, most of them, if not all of them, original fairy tales. This is actually one that I quite enjoyed, and in this one we meet Sybil, who is a female wizard. She lives in her castle alone with all of her animal companions, and she has completely closed herself off from the outside world. But then one day, she finds a baby boy at her doorstep. She takes him in, she raises him, and of course this is not a normal baby boy, so she gets sucked in with the intrigues of the outside world, and more happens, of course. Now, I really enjoyed this one. This is a very quick read. It's only 240 pages and the font is absolutely massive, so you will fly through this one. And it's also not very difficult. This is, of course, an original fairy tale, so the theme and the overall message is most important. Don't really expect very deep and morally great characters or anything like that, but for what it was, I quite enjoyed it, and I think if you like animal companions, you need to give this one a try. Then next up, one that is very well known. It was one of my favorite reads of last year, and I was absolutely not expecting that. And I actually have a spoiler-filled vlog for this book. And that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is a strange book. In this one, we meet Piranesi. Piranesi lives in an enormous building that is made up of an infinite amount of rooms that are filled with these beautiful statues and pillars. Now, Piranesi doesn't really know why he's there. He doesn't know if this is the entire world, and he doesn't know where all the other people are, because he only knows of one other person, and that is the person that he calls the Other. In this book, we actually meet Piranesi and we see what is happening through his journal entries. And his journal entries are beautifully crafted. I think that the writing style of Susanna Clarke in this book is really masterfully, and I absolutely enjoyed the writing style more than anything. But the mystery is here as well. You want to know what's happening and you want to discover everything together with Piranesi. Now, you might think that this then gives it a gloomy feel, but it doesn't really feel like that. It actually feels pretty light and beautiful, but there is that mystery and you want to discover what happened. I love this book from beginning to end, and I highly recommend this, especially if you like the more unique way of conveying a story. Now, I know that I just talked about Patricia A. McKillop, but there is one other book by her that I want to include, and that is Alphabet of Thorn. With 288 pages, it's just below the 300-page mark. I absolutely adore this one. I think that this is my favorite one by her. I like The Forgotten Beasts of Eld, but this one is better. It's more fleshed out, the characters are just better crafted in my opinion, and the story is beautiful. We actually have multiple timelines and we have multiple people that we follow, but the spill figure here is definitely a young female translator. She lives in the School of Translation and her job is just to translate everything that arrives on her desk. One day she gets a very special book that nobody, including the other translators, can understand, but she somehow can. And of course, this opens up the entire world, we get some political intrigue, this has a very significant meaning for the rest of the story. I like the conclusion of this book so much that the more I think about it, I think that this might be a 5-star read. So yes, of course, highly recommend this one as well. Then I have two books that I quickly want to mention because they are sci-fi, they're not fantasy, but they are very short and I really enjoyed them. And I think if you like fantasy, you will probably like these two as well. And that is A Psalm for the Wild-Built by Becky Chambers, the first book in the Monk and Robot series. The second one is coming out this summer. And then This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El Motar and Max Gladstone. I have talked about both of these in a dual review that I will link in the description box down below if you want to know more. But yes, these two short books I highly recommend as well. Now I just quickly want to mention 3 honorable mentions that are between 300 and 330 pages. And the first one is Dark Sea's End by Richard Nell. Now I wanted to include this one because I have talked about the Ash and Sand trilogy by this author multiple times as the grimdark series that you really need to pick up. It's amazing. However, not a lot of people know that he has written in this world beyond the Ash and Sand trilogy. This is the Beyond Ash and Sand trilogy, the first book. And I also think that not everybody really likes grimdark. This book is much less grimdark than the original trilogy. Sure, there are some morally grey characters here. We have a pirate who's definitely not always on the right side of the law, but all of the characters here are trying to do good. So even if you're not the biggest fan of grimdark, I think you will still really enjoy this book. If you do still want to read grimdark, I would highly recommend picking up the Ash and Sand trilogy before this one, because chronologically the events of this book take place after the original trilogy. But you can definitely just pick this up without any other information of the Ash and Sand trilogy, and I highly recommend this book. It's not as dense, it's not as epic, and because of that, it's just a quick and fun read. Then next I have my favorite Greek myth retelling, which has 328 pages, and that is The Children of Jocasta by Natalie Haynes. This is a retelling of the legend of Oedipus, and so because of that, it is of course a Greek tragedy. This is told in 2 different timelines, and I think that the second timeline is actually an addition of the author and that wasn't present in the original myth. But I could be wrong here. And because of that, I didn't really know how these 2 timelines were going to connect with each other. And that revelation was something that I quite enjoyed. So yes, definitely one that I would highly recommend. And the audiobook is also very well done. So if you are an audiobook enthusiast, definitely give this one a try. And then the last book that I want to recommend, actually an entire series, and that is the Enchanter General series, the first book being Ironfoot by Dave Duncan. Now this is historical fantasy, and what I really appreciated here was how well this was executed, and you can definitely see that the author knows what happened in this time period. This story takes place around the same time as when we had King Richard Lionheart, and in the third book we actually have an entire plot that revolves around the Crusades. In this first book we meet Durwin, and Durwin is a crippled boy who one day accidentally corrects an old spell, and this spell predicts murder. And then a couple of days later, somebody in a nearby village, a very important person, gets murdered. So because of this, Durwin is sent to investigate this, and of course he quickly rises in the ranks of Sage. I really enjoyed this one. It's a very quick series. The first one, the second one, the third one, each of them has a mystery in them, and it almost feels like fantasy meets Sherlock Holmes, because Durwin also has a sidekick, and I really enjoyed this one. It's definitely not the best series ever, but I think that for what they are, they just executed very well. And if you want to know more about this, I actually have an entire spoiler-free review for the entire trilogy. So definitely one that I would highly recommend, and that doesn't really get a lot of praise on BookTube. I don't think that I've ever heard anybody talk about it actually. So those were all the short fantasy books that I wanted to recommend. Please let me know in the comments down below if you have any recommendations for me that I can put on my TBR. And if you still want to have some other fantasy recommendations, I highly recommend you to watch this video next. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the video, and see you next time. Bye!